And Elizabeth, I have to thank you immensely for joining me on this Monday evening, on this October 7th, for this installment of JT the LA Storyteller podcast, which is a discussion about a few of the measures on the November 2024 ballot, as well as a discussion on measures that are especially local for us. So I'm really glad to have you here, and I am happy to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the listenership, to the Los Cuentos listenership out there, by all means.
Hi, thanks for having me. This I'm excited. This is fun. So yeah, I'm a reporter for LA Public Press, which has been around for a couple of years now. And we're trying to cover LA in a new and different way. I have been covering LA in an old and same way for like many years. I mean, I try to do something different, but I've worked at a lot of local places that are pretty traditional, like Wire Service and LA Daily News, if you've heard of that. So yeah, a lot of like traditional outlets where I've covered LA City and other little cities around. Yeah, so I'm glad to be here to kind of put a few like measures on the radar. One big one that I guess everyone's probably sick of hearing about by now. A couple of big ones, but a few that you might not have really paid attention to, but it might be nice to learn about.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so, because there are so many different measures on the ballot this year, because there are so many different, say, propositions and choices dividing voters' attention in one way or another, this discussion will delve into a handful of what is being proposed this year, but not everything. And for everything else, I'm happy to provide notes. I'm sure that you are just as well. But today, at least, the big two, at least statewide, are Prop 36 and Prop 33, but especially Prop 36 for Los Angeles, I think, because it's the mega city, it's the elephant in California, if you will. And when it comes to crime and policing, and our policy on crime and policing, no city is impacted more than Los Angeles in the state of California. So I think getting started with Prop 36 is very apropos, as they might say. And I'd really like to ask you then about the history of this proposition, where it all began, and why it's taking up so much noise, why it's making so much noise and taking up so much space in these last few weeks before election day. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Well, from what I've gathered, this measure, it has kind of like it kind of sets up two different approaches to address certain issues like drug and drug related and theft crimes. And if I'm not sure if many people have heard of Proposition 47. I know it keeps coming back as a topic among a lot of people. It was passed back in 10 years ago in 2014, um, in the middle of like a um, really serious problem of overcrowding in prisons. And so it was meant to reform a lot of the law enforcement approach to these crimes, which include shoplifting and drug possession. And so it led to like a huge amount of incarceration, especially in communities where there are people of color. And so it led to a lot of disparities. And the conditions within the prisons were quite um, bad. There were high rates of deaths and suicide because of the overcrowding conditions and lack of mental health and medical care, right? So go, I think it's good to go back to some of that because it kind of germinated from that approach of like there's a different approach that you can address these crimes in a different way that doesn't involve law enforcement. And then you have the other side that is saying that you need harsher enforcement, law enforcement wise, in order to deter people from committing these crimes. And so I think we're still back in 2014 in a way, or not 2014, but like back in the days before 2014 became a thing where they passed Proposition 47, which is that now we have this kind of like head-to-head fight again between the two kinds of approaches. And so Proposition 36 does um, change a few things that were in Proposition 47, and that includes um, let's see. That includes basically taking some minor theft and drug crime penalties and changing it from misdemeanors to felony. And so the Proposition 47 made thefts of things that were valued at less than $950 and made it misdemeanors. So this would make it felony again for people who have two or more past convictions. And then it lengthens felony sentences for people involved in a crime in which three or more people were involved. And it calls for mandating drug treatment for people who are charged with felonies
Mm.
around possession. So I think I probably should have mentioned that a lot of this happened amid kind of like this heightened attention around retail theft, different kinds like shoplifting, but also like so-called organized retail theft, or what we often think of as smash and grabs. So like, and also the fentanyl crisis that we keep hearing about, right? And so like there's like all these things that we keep hearing about and that we are kind of like, oh my God, we need to do something about this. So retail theft has gone up. Uh, Retailers are saying that people are getting really organized and attacking retailers with smash and grabs. And then we gotta like address this fentanyl crisis, which has led to deaths. So a lot of this language in the proposition is kind of tailored to those concerns. Yeah, so so the the origins of this belt measure was back in April, when like this group set up or qualified for this ballot measure for the ballot. So like basically that group was funded by retail, big box retail like Walmart and Target. Um, and so I think like there's just like, a lot of people, I think it seems like it's based on polling, even back in May and then now recently in just the last month, September, people seem to be saying that they want to vote in favor of this proposition. So going back to like a tougher on crime kind of approach, that Proposition 47 was meant to help undo.
Mm.
So yeah, we're returning to that conversation here. Um, Let's see. Anything that you find interesting? I think local. Okay, so one of the things about Proposition 47 is that it was meant to reduce the prison population, and so that was meant to like alleviate also the costs, around incarcerating people. So since it went into effect, it's been about $800 million in savings, which have, it's required for that money to then go to programs in the community, right? For like housing, services, mental health, substance use treatment, and things like that. And so that amount of funding is probably around like now like $100 million a year. And so based on like the legislative analysts office that kind of looked at the costs and like what the potential impact might be. They were saying that if Proposition 36 passes, about tens of millions of dollars of savings would be reduced. So that would affect a lot of like the groups that get funding from that
Mm.
to address this. So like
Mhm.
that's something that was raised by recently the LA County Board of Supervisors. They approved a resolution to oppose Proposition 36. So that's one of the parties that is kind of like, we don't want Proposition 36 to pass. It's because like, they're one of the agencies or, jurisdictions that kind of receive the funding and then like, you know, um, send it out to different groups. And so, yeah, it has also effects on programs um, that is supposed to like benefit people who are, coming out of incarceration, um, or just to create a condition in the community where people kind of feel supported by services and that kind of thing that, will prevent like an incarceration approach.
Mhm.
So I can go into more about it, but it's kind
Mhm.
of like that's sort of the main, fight here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic framing for this discussion because when you take us back to 2014 for a moment, what you're noting for us is that this is really a conversation about whether so-called restorative justice has been effective or not, or whether it's actually hugely responsible for the crime that has been spotlighted, especially since the pandemic, especially since 2020 in the marches for George Floyd, a significant handful of which turned into so-called rioting or so-called looting. And so I think this is very much in conversation with this moment post the pandemic up to a point. But then, as you pointed out, it also goes all the way back to 2014 because as soon as this law was passed, a number of different groups were interested in repealing that law. And a number of different groups, even prior to this retail theft, say, spotlighting that has been a major item in the news most recently. Even prior to that, Prop 47 was pointed out by, say, the Union of Correctional Officers as being majorly responsible for a lot of new crime on the street and a lot of new illicit activities on the street and a lot less consequences for petty theft as well as something that is grander, something that is more serious in scale. And I don't know that a lot of voters may see it this way, right? I think that if not for our framing, it might just seem like a naturally logical idea that retail theft should be punished, that it should be punished pretty seriously, and that as a society, we should take a step in doing exactly that. But in actuality, Prop 47 was passed due to, as you pointed out, prison overcrowding and serious losses in terms of what it cost to house a single inmate, which is more expensive now than at any point in the state's history. And so I do think it merits repeating or it merits noting that should we return to harsh on crime laws once again in the state of California, we run the risk of overcrowding prison populations yet again, which are more expensive than ever now, because the last that I saw, I believe it's twice as much as tuition for a college student in the state of California to house a single inmate for a year. And so taxpayers and communities should definitely know that we will foot the bill, or we run the risk of really footing the bill here in a serious way, and at a time when the state is already looking at a deficit, to be certain, which we've also sort of had to think about over the last year, a deficit that we're going to be dealing with for a number of years already, cuts to programs coming because of this sort of wicked economy post the pandemic. So just a couple of other notes, I think, to keep into consideration for this discussion.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think about is to like I think people might be frustrated about why things are still not seeming or feeling great. And I think a lot of it has to do, like a lot of this measure appears to kind of want to address people's concerns around homelessness. The name includes homelessness and drug use, and a lot of times theft and drug use is often tied with homelessness, and I don't know exactly. I was kind of looking around and see what the connection might exactly be, like specifically, right, to homelessness. And so, like some of the, I think part of it is like I think a lot of people are connecting a few things, with each other, and I think one of the things I kind of wonder about is too, like what the existing kind of like services and support is actually available out there. And I think one of the things that I've asked about is just, even with the services that you hear about under Prop 47, that's geared towards like people re-entering or getting services and housing and that kind of thing. Like how much is actually available to people now? Like even in this particular measure, it talks about mandating treatment, drug addiction treatment. And so like I think it often makes it so that like I think the idea behind that is probably that like, you got to be pushed into it. Otherwise you won't want to the person doesn't want to go into rehab, right? And I guess like to begin with, I think different people have different approaches. Like, does law does the criminal justice system really need to be involved in a health issue or not? And some people think it does. It's like even some people who are, I've heard who are addicted to drugs or will say that actually need something difficult and harsh to happen. But I think like one of the things that a group called Disability Rights California has pointed out is that there's like often like shrinking funding available for even the treatment side of things. So like one thing that they pointed out when I've asked them about this is that there's been changes to Medi-Cal that it would fund like 1 to 3 months of treatment versus what it used to be, which is 6 to 9 months. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that is worth thinking about, I guess, because I think about it,
Yeah.
like I think about it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, what that really brings to mind is just who has been given the opportunity to speak about Prop 47 in a serious way and what Prop 36 may entail for them or their programming or the services they provide. I think about something like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, for example, also known as ARC, which for at least a decade now has provided serious re-entry programs to those formerly incarcerated so that they could successfully reintegrate into society and become productive members of society, oftentimes creating rehabilitative or restorative programs that were seriously lacking while they were inside. And I think about those types of voices and how we need to uplift them at this moment in which a lot of the spectaculars certainly gets out there, a lot of TikTok reels, and a lot of quick sound bites. They all filter through the air and create this sense that we're going to hell in a handbasket and real quick. But I think, especially speaking with folks who have benefited from the reinvestment of dollars that would have gone towards solely incarcerating those accused and convicted of a crime, hearing from them as to how their programs might be seriously impacted by the passage of Prop 36, that's that's something that's very much in our interest because these are real lives on the line. And I think it'd be fruitful not just for them, but also for the retailers who may be given this false sense of of hope by something such as Prop 36, because oftentimes the promise of criminalization certainly sounds better than what it actually looks like when it comes down to it. So with that in mind, are there any sort of summary notes or are there any sort of final thoughts on Prop 36 before we move on to the next item on the ballot up for consideration? Or do you think we've covered just enough?
I think just enough, although I have like a nerdy little thing that I want to mention is like sometimes it's interesting and fun to look at the or horrifying, I don't know, to look at the campaign finance filings. And the state website, Cal Access, actually has some pretty nifty ways of presenting it. If you go there, I can probably provide a link that you can include later on, but like there's a link, this will apply for the next one too, to how it's funded. They make it really easy to look it up by the measure. And so uh, that is actually something that I think anyone can kind of take a look at if they wanted to.
Oh yeah, and just to be sure, is that the Chief Legislative Analyst's office or what
It
link?
would be the Secretary of State, California Secretary of State's campaign finance
Okay.
site. Let me just take a look now.
So what you're saying is that we could see which groups are for and which groups are against this measure.
Yeah, yeah, they organize it because sometimes it's kind of hard to find, like there's like a bunch of different ones. Like it's not just one, right? That actually is funding support or is funding opposed. Like there's different various groups that is doing that. And so like there's like four committees that oppose, wait, one, two, three. Three committees oppose and three committees that support. Um
Could
and
could
so
we shout them out for a moment to be
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's like one that's set up, it looks like by a mayor in San Jose, or includes the mayor in San Jose. They have fun names, so it's not like it's all very clear about like who is actually behind them. You have to like look inside, but there's some that like one is more obvious, like it's sponsored by the California Retailers Association. That's the one that supports. And then there's one that opposes, and it's funded by the Ella Baker Center Action Fund. Um, and they support criminal justice reform.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, let's see. I think I don't know, I'm not seeing everything that I think, yeah, maybe this one. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of local organizations that I think are opposing it that a lot of people may have heard of, like Dignity and Power, La Defensa. There's also like LA Community Action Network that's opposing it.
Mm.
Um, and so then there's also, yeah, I mean, I don't know necessarily. Okay, so let me think. Let's see. For the local ones that do support, I don't know. Anyway, so we can try to look for that, but I don't see any committees necessarily that are the ones like local ones. But yeah.
Right, right. I mean, it brings to mind just once again the outsized impact that this measure would have on Los Angeles County, but also the inverse, which is that if Los Angeles County comes out for this in a serious way, then that does have a determining or determinative power over the ultimate result here, just due to the 10 million residents that have some access to voting power. Not that all 10 million people vote here, but given the fact that it's a presidential election year, we're likely to have more people, significantly more people than we had in March. And so it'll be interesting to see how LA and LA County specifically uh, comes comes out for or against Prop 36 this year. I hadn't thought of that until you mentioned it just now.
Yeah. And I just wanted to like make sure I'm clear that like I don't know if some of the other groups that I mentioned that are opposed have actually, contributed funding. I just know that there is Dignity and Power did set up a committee to
Mm.
oppose, but that's kind of all I know about that.
No, shout out to all the groups that you spotlighted.
So yeah, I probably need to take a little bit closer look at them, but yeah, I think other than that, I guess we could do the next one.
Yeah, by all means, absolutely. The next one up for consideration is Prop 33, which is essentially a repeal of something known as the Costa-Hawkins Act, which was passed in 1995 after being drafted by two legislators in the state Senate or the state assembly at that time. And so this has to do with rent control. RSO units and what counts as an RSO unit and where. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about the framing here. How do we set this up for folks? What does Prop 33 come down to? And what does it undo or what does it not really undo?
Okay. So I haven't been looking at this that closely. I'm like just regular Joe voter at this point. So we can have like a back and forth discussion about this. I think
Yeah.
you took an interest and I have been interested, but just haven't had a chance to take a close look at it. So basically what I've kind of gathered is basically single family and apartment buildings built after 1995. You can't do rent control on those. Or if you like, if a city wanted to do that, they would not be able to. And
Like right
so,
now, we're not able to do that.
right. And so, like, this is the kind of thing that has been like, you know, apparently restricting, more rent control units from being put under rent control or units for being put under rent control and restrict single family homes. So, LA City does have a rent stabilization ordinance. They don't call it rent control, they call it stabilization. And so like they restrict the increases that can be done each year by a certain amount. And so like something similar for that under like a Costa-Hawkins for like these types of buildings um isn't apparently available for on the menu, right? So that's something that is kind of we've all heard about it in the past few years of this coming back and people wanting to repeal Costa-Hawkins and so that we can do more rent control. And that those have failed. So this is like the latest attempt at that. And then you also, I think we had a talk beforehand about this, but like there were some interesting things about this. And one of them is that the ballot measure is backed by a couple of interesting characters in LA. One is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, a group that has been somewhat controversial, I guess. Different things, different reasons, I suppose. But one of them, I think, the LA Times has definitely like really drilled in on them with their management of some buildings. I mean, I've heard different things, like they've had different like they've done a lot of things too that is beneficial. And so like, like that's why it's kind of like, they're kind of colorful characters, I guess, in a way. So the management of buildings, like, they're being accused of being slumlords, I guess. And so like that's a thing. And then
Well,
the other
and just to be clear on that point, what we are saying is that the major funder for Prop 33 and hoping to repeal Costa-Hawkins, that is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which has poured millions, tens of millions into uh, trying to convince voters to pass this measure this year. And which is doing so for the third time actually, because this is kind of the third, yeah, the the third lap around the block, so to speak, for the AIDS Healthcare Foundation when it's come to repealing Costa-Hawkins, especially.
Yeah. And the other interesting person, you want to talk about that? Who is funding this or helping to fund it?
Oh, well, I mean, and that is in terms of the opposition.
Oh, no, no, in favor of it. So one of the committees is a Kevin DeLeon committee.
Right. Which is a friend of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, or which has been a friend of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and which is suspect because, well, given the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's property in Skid Row, especially, which is in Kevin DeLeon's district, there's been a lot of speculation as to whether or not Kevin DeLeon's office has actually reached out and held them accountable for slum management and seriously unsanitary conditions, especially at the Madison Hotel or this SRO, I believe it is, that is managed by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and which has been managed by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation since 2017. So there's a weird concoction of how these various players are involved with each other and this measure, actually.
Yeah, and I guess that's what makes politics kind of interesting. But anyway, so then like, but the thing is though, this measure is supported by a lot of groups that are have done a lot of work around tenants protections and things that, support tenants. And then it's being opposed by groups that are representing landlords. So the usual matchup, the
Like
people who
the
support the
Howard
measure.
Jarvis Taxpayers Association on the opposing side, that is.
Yeah, California Apartments Association on the um, opposing side. And I think AGLA even has some committee set up. So yeah, whereas on the other side, it's groups like ACE, which does a lot of organizing in LA around tenants protections. Yeah, just like the 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 big groups that do a lot and get, I think a lot of times get a lot done. So yeah, like and like it's supported by a bunch of people who you would normally think of as like having tried to get more tenant and tenant protections in LA, like one and others, pushing for it at least,
Yeah.
trying to. So yeah, it's kind of like it's still kind of like a conversation where there's this group and there's that group and they're kind of, and for voters, I know it's kind of like, well, you know, yeah.
Right, and what we should also note is that repealing Costa-Hawkins in this scenario, or saying yes to Prop 33 this year, would give cities permission to enact rent control, but that is not a guarantee that every last city in California will in fact do that, right? It is still ultimately left up to local city or municipal governments to enact such laws within their jurisdiction or within their boundaries. So it's not that rent control into single family housing would immediately go into effect, or that rent control on units built after 1995 would immediately go into effect after we pass Prop 33. What ends up happening is just that cities now have the permission, so to speak, to enact such laws if they do so via the usual city or municipal council process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because I feel like sometimes these fights can't just be done through like enacting something like that alone or like it goes beyond that, it kind of goes into this conversation that still needs to be had about or a fight that needs to be had about what we think housing is and who has who has kind of like you know who benefits from it. And so I think like I was, yeah, because like I had assumed like Casa Huck as well. If you're gonna go, yeah, gotta go to the ballot, to like repeal this. But like the question is like it is a law that was put into place by the state legislature, which if that's the case, I guess my question for for myself and everyone else, like who's gonna go do some research, is kind of like, well, then why isn't it being repealed legislatively? Why is it ain't going like where is that, you know, why isn't that happening or why couldn't that happen? Or maybe the answer is very simple and there's something I don't know very simple that answers that question. But yeah, like that's another way to do it.
Right.
So
There you go. I think that's a key way of putting it, actually, is that there are various ways to engage the housing dilemma, the housing dearth, the housing crisis in the state, including through the legislative process. Instead, it's been passed down to voters, and now we are here talking about the possibilities of Prop 33 and maybe what may lie ahead, but which is not promised because yeah, there are so many different ways to engage the housing crisis, starting by building more housing and enabling more housing to be built. But we are a long way from that, including right here in LA County, where we're short of some 600 to 800,000 units that are needed over the next 10 years for residents here. So uh, Prop 33 is very much a faint step in a much longer road ahead for us on this side of the United States, out here in the West Coast, out here in California.
Yep. It's a it's probably gonna be a huge fight. So like it would be a huge fight if you were to have it discussed legislatively or even yeah. So okay. So I
Yeah.
mean that's all I got
Yeah.
for this good measure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Shout out also to Godfrey Santos Plata at this moment, because it was in a discussion with Godfrey that I learned that most of the Assembly and most of the California Congress is actually comprised of realtors or landlords or property managers themselves, rather than renters and folks who know what it is to live with uncertainty from one month to the next due to their housing. So yeah, we got a long way to go in terms of really creating more of a democratic representation between property owners and those without property at the legislative level here in the state of California. So just a brief mention to Godfrey and the work at LA Forward. Keep doing your thing. And they're also another great resource for folks to go and read up on more of these topics and then some, actually. And now, with this noted for us, Elizabeth, I want to leave the state for a moment and kind of come back home to LA County and actually LA City specifically, because we have a few measures or propositions right here at the local level that I think are also really easy to gloss over, especially when they're sort of hidden in this very formal language and in this very sort of inaccessible framing when they read it through their ballot. So I want to talk a little bit about the redistricting process in particular. And I want to ask you a little bit about how redistricting has made its way on to the scene this November. And for those listeners who might be hearing about redistricting for the first time ever today, I like to say that it's more easily broached or thought of as remapping and basically redrawing uh, one political boundary versus another. And so in the city of Los Angeles, fair redistricting has been a sticky situation, especially over the last couple of years, but actually it goes back even farther than that. And nonetheless, I want to ask you a little bit about redistricting on the ballot for specifically the city of Los Angeles this year. Please tell us more.
Yes. Okay. So if you look at the city ballot measures, they're not the easiest to like get excited about. But for one of them, it's on this process of drawing political boundaries, which I think the easiest way to think about it is this affects each political official's. It's a question of are these political boundaries going to benefit the personal interests and ambitions of a particular political official, politician, um, or is it supposed to, I guess, give give communities the voice and the power to kind of like, you know, be represented by somebody that will advocate for their interests. And
Mhm.
so there's actually two measures. It's not just city. So the city and the LAUSD's map drawing process is both on the ballot, and it's meant to make it so that the process is independent. And so it takes decision power over what the map looks like, or tries to shift it away from the political officials who I'm not going to say they're going to do it, but they're going to have the opportunity to do it under this because right now the city of LA, city council, and the mayor decide what the map looks like. And the county and the state both have independent redistricting processes. And so LA is actually kind of unique in that the politicians who stand to benefit from those lines and how they're drawn, like you can draw them around the voters that will likely vote for you, right? And so, so like that's literally the thing that think that politicians might think about when they're drawing these lines and then fight over, right? Like some might lose, some might win, and so most of the time we're like kind of having these conversations about like, is this one going to benefit or is this one going to lose, right? Like, it's more about that than it is about like setting up these boundaries where people within the community kind of like feel like they have enough of a common interest with the others in that district to be able to come together and elect an official that will represent them in the right way. So, or in the best way, I guess. And so yeah, so like the independent redistricting is meant to like make it so that it's less about personal ambition and more about the community. Um, and this is an interesting topic because it just redistricting just happened, and I know that some people might be aware of the leaked tapes that came out in which several city council members and the local labor leader we're having conversations in which members of the city council were like expressing a lot of racist like um, thoughts about different groups in the community and lots of homophobic thoughts. And so that was kind of like the league tapes was like Nuri Martinez, Gil Cedillo, and Kevin De Leon, and Ron Ferreira, who leads the led the Labor Federation at the time. And because of those comments, the council president stepped down. That was Nuri Martinez. Um, and people have been calling for Kevin De Leon to step down, but he hasn't. But the conversation that they were having was actually around redistricting because it was in the middle of the 2021 redistricting process, that the most recent one. And so they were having conversations basically around like, well, this neighborhood, I don't want this neighborhood in my district or in this district because like, Gil Cedillo was running for re-election, others were. And then like one of the losers in that particular conversation was Nithya Raman,
The
who,
biggest loser in that combo.
yeah, I mean, the most prominently talked about loser in that conversation around redistricting.
But a real winner for the record. She just won her primary race this past month.
I don't mean to say, but I'm just saying, like, the idea behind what happened with her was that she came in with a district that had more renters in it. And so those are the kind of voters that brought her into office. But then after the redistricting, there were fewer renters and more homeowners. So then if she was running on a platform that was supposed to be more like tenant focused, or like at least, caring about tenants versus just caring about homeowners, she's gonna have to shift a little bit in order to like feel like she has a chance at re-election, I guess. So like that kind of thing is like it does have effects like that. And so it's a roundabout way of just saying like, yeah, just to take a look. A lot of these city measures, they don't have any opposition, right? Like they're just like, we're doing this,
Exist.
there's no real like major like fight going on. And independent redistricting is one of those things that other places have done. And when this was put on the ballot, it's just kind of like, well, you know, the city of LA is next on doing this. And it's just also very interesting that the city of LA has had like this process where literally like the people who benefit gets to decide. And then like basically that's what happened. Like, and then so that's kind of like that. Um,
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's just as you said, that's what happened, right? Like we have a situation that is undemocratic, that sounds and looks undemocratic, and that ultimately remains in effect because that's just the way it's gone since time immemorial. And if not for calls for accountability on the part of the public and public outrage over not just those leaked audio recordings, but also the subject or the focus of those leaked audio recordings, especially when it came to redistricting, we might just have this swept under the rug for another decade, um, because it's not the first time that a handful of constituents have called for a fair redistricting process. This has actually happened uh, decades on end, including for Koreatown or including in Koreatown, which before this last redistricting process was divided into three, really disenfranchising, especially Asian American voters, from the potential to elect an Asian American representative at the city council level. And so these folks have also voiced their serious frustration with how the process has gone. And now, given that leaked audio, actually, it was just the other day that I read a little bit about how I believe the state attorney is still investigating how they may completely remake the maps that we have been given. So it's kind of an interesting moment, right? Because I wonder whether or not the passage of this measure or lack thereof ends up having a real effect on the outcome, since I think that we're just around the corner from a serious revamping here, since a lot of different groups are studying just how unfairly this process played out most recently, but also how it's been undemocratic from the outset, and it needs a real fixing. So kind of a real interesting moment, or very much a real interesting moment for this talk about reshaping and remaking the political boundaries in the interest of the public rather than in the interest of a few political power holders.
Yeah. And there's some interesting developments lately. I just want to make sure to note that this measure calls for the independent redistricting to begin in 2031.
Hmm.
Um, and that yeah, so the investigation by the Attorney General, State Attorney General, there's some recent news about that. I don't know too much about it. The LA Times reported on it, so they're the experts on it, but like it's basically Rob Bonta wanting the city to agree to um redo the 2021 redistricting by 2026. LA City doesn't actually have to wait every 10 years. They can actually do it earlier, but this is not about that. But basically, like I don't really know for sure at this moment whether or not like they would be able to implement like an independent registering process, or if they're going to use the old one, or like there's a lot of like stuff that I don't know, but I'm sure if you keep following the coverage of it, we'll kind of get clarification on that. So.
Yeah, and just so that we're clear here, I think what is also key to note is that the measure on the ballot was drafted by the LA City Council in large part, right? And was placed on the ballot by LA City Council in the wake of the scandal. So once again, we may be in 2024, but this discussion really accelerated after 2022, November 2022, when these leaked audio discussions completely defamed and discredited LA City Council. So since that time, this measure has been advanced, and in particular, the former LA City Council president, Paul Krikorian, had quite a bit of his hands in the process, to some dismay, depending on who you ask.
Mm. Yes. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's also kind of there was already frustrations even during the redistricting before all the tapes came out just about the process too, you know.
Mhm.
It's like the redistricting commission that was set up and put all this work into creating a map and then sent it over to the city council and then they completely switched it up. So yeah, like not completely, but basically they did a lot of switch up on it. So yeah, so like that is yeah, whatever. We can move on to the next topic too, because I feel like yeah, we have a
Yeah,
few more.
of course, of course. And the next topic is also very much in conversation with what is fair, actually. It concerns the LA Ethics Commission and an independent LA Ethics Commission. So maybe you can provide us with a little bit of context as to how the current Ethics Commission plays out or what role it has for LA City Council and what its powers are and what powers it actually lacks, which this measure may be trying to account for.
Yeah, yeah. So, LA City has an ethics commission that does oversight of like ethical behavior by elected officials. But like there's always been some concern about just how independent they can be to do strong oversight. Because they're well, for one thing, their budget is decided by the city council members and the mayor. So that kind of leaves them vulnerable about like, how much they can really do without like maybe facing some kind of like retaliation.
Hmm.
I'm not gonna say like, but basically it's open to that, right? And then and I think we kind of might, I don't know, it's retaliation. It's just more like, here's something that like we have power over that you're like you desperately need, you know. And so so this measure at the very least sets an annual minimum annual budget for the commission. So it tries to do that. It tries to strengthen it that way. It also makes it so that, and this was actually the case with the redistricting commission, right? Like they also like kind of made sure that the people who sit on it, they put restrictions on who sits on like, so in the past, the last one we talked about, they put restrictions on who can sit on the redistricting commission, and they can't be people with too many ties and too cozy, right? Like so lobbyists and like people who have, so this one is basically this is a similar concept is that they want to make sure that people who are appointed to this ethics commission are not like a paid campaign consultant or like someone who like basically is like a major donor, in a campaign. And like I think this is probably like relevant because like we already see an example of this in the last appointment of um, Alex Johnson, who is formerly with a company called Bryson Gillette that does a lot of campaign consulting. So like not sure whether or not he personally was paid for a campaign in the last 12 months before being appointed, but like if that was the case, under this one, it would be so that like someone like that would not be allowed to be appointed to this commission. And so like it kind of cleans up a lot of that stuff for the ethics commission to make it stronger.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's kind of another interesting one to look at. There's a few others, but I think this one and the last one might be good for people to keep an eye on, just for themselves and kind of like take an interest in when they're voting.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm so glad to bring it up with you just because these very local measures, despite having everything to do with the governance of the second largest city in the United States, they don't get a lot of discussion, even in the city. There is a real lack of coverage or underreporting here that we have to contend with. So I think it's absolutely of interest to those of y'all who are looking at these ballots for the first time ever in some cases and wondering, hey, like where do I begin? And just what is all this talking about? We have now discussed fair redistricting as well as an independent ethics commission for the city of Los Angeles, and it's up to voters to decide whether they're for or against that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so like with those two, I think part of what makes it interesting now is because there's actually a lot of activity around like governance reform, like ethics and redistricting is on the ballot. Um, and I think with the city of LA, there were plans to do a lot more than even just what's on the ballot now. There are some really like interesting ideas that were being discussed at the city level, right? Like we have currently 15 council members. There were discussion about expanding that number to 20 something to 30 to
Yeah.
even, well, I don't know. People were saying 50 is a possibility, but like just to think about, right? Because other cities like New York have that many. Um, but like that was something that was being discussed for quite a long time for City of LA. They were gonna like talk about it and talk about they were like, some people were saying let's try to get it on this ballot, right?
It's-
Increasing the number of people, but they just never got it done. Like they never figured it out. Like they never decided, okay, we're gonna try to do this, right?
And that is
So
the city, right? The LA City Council never got it or never figured out how to get this on the ballot this year, correct?
yeah, they at the end of last year they were talking about it and then they kind of just dropped it. Like some members were like, I still need to study it. I don't know what it means, you know. And then so like this is set up for the next thing, but like so basically like um that has been pushed off to like this charter commission that is being set up now. So the city is going to try to talk about it now. But there's another thing on the ballot that kind of has outpaced the city of LA, which is the county of LA County, has actually done something where like they just kind of like it was like a surprise kind of like July kind of announcement thing where like Lindsay Horvath and Janice Hahn came out and did a news conference and they're like, we're gonna put something on the or we're gonna try to put something on the ballot to increase the number of people on the board of supervisors from 5 to 9 people. They also like proposed making the county CEO, which is like there's a kind of a similar position now, but it's like a appointed position, right? But then they're going to make it an elected position. So the way to think about this is that this proposed county CEO has, from what I can tell, like very similar authorities and powers and duties as the LA city mayor. So in a way, and I've asked them, are you trying to say that, is it okay to call this like the county mayor? And they're like, yeah, that's the idea,
Yeah.
kind of. Right? And then so then the other thing that they're also doing is, well, the LA County actually doesn't have what LA City has, which is an ethics commission. So like another thing in this Measure G. I'm talking about Measure G. So Measure G on the LA County. So they are also proposing an ethics commission and the Office of Ethics Compliance to be set up by 2026. And so these things are just kind of like on the November ballot. I mean, to kind of like the caveat is kind of like the county is way bigger, right? And to be represented by 5 people is kind of a bigger deal than maybe like even the city of LA. Like when people I was talking to about the city of LA stuff, like they were like, well, you know, it's even more of a big deal at the county because like you have 5 people and like maybe that should happen for, like I don't know, people are just kind of like griping about this idea of like expanding the city of LA council. And then like it was like, okay, well, like what about the county? So like in a way, kind of like, you know, uh perhaps it was more of a issue for the county for a much longer time than the city council. So it
Yeah.
maybe not. Maybe they're not outpacing. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
it's funny because there's an interesting irony there. The LA County Board, which is made up of 5 members, can pass certain proposals by a vote of 3 to 2 or a vote of 3-0. I believe even in Measure G, that is,
Mhm.
not every member of the board actually voted. At least 2 abstained from what I recall looking at.
Yeah.
And nonetheless, this went ahead and got done. Whereas at LA City Council, where you have 15 different members,
Mm.
somehow, though there were more among them, though there were more talking heads and different political teams which could have come together, they failed to advance an actual expansion of their city council body as they had initially thought they just might do, even as recently as last year. And so, kind of an interesting ironic situation there, the way that you can sometimes do more with less and sometimes less with more, which of course is what we're pitching to voters on this November's ballot. Can we
That's a
expand the board and do more? And can we maybe sort of keep the current structure at LA City Council and somehow do more from there on? I don't know, but we leave it to the voters, and it's a little bit of a riffraff there, but one worth exploring, one worth researching some more into for oneself.
Yeah, I think I sort of probably glossed over this a little bit, but I guess traditionally like people are like more politicians, that's probably like a terrible idea. But
Yeah,
I think the kind of the idea behind the expansion thing is that like you are a person that represents fewer people, so you are more available to or just more accessible, right? To the average person. Not this like they call the board of supervisor members the five kings or queens, right? Like they're like they have this fiefdom or some kind, like that's kind of how people think about it. And so like it's like this whole entire country that like, representing and stuff like that. And like it's like this feeling of like remove. And so like the expansion folks are just kind of like, you need to bring them down a little bit closer to people. But then at the same time, I think there's also this other side of things where like people are like that the council members probably want that kind of like sweeping kind of power, some of them. So
yeah,
um,
yeah. And I
they
think
may not want to bring things down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think the discussion can get very esoteric and theoretical because even when it comes to, say, m- advocacy for more city council representatives at the local city level, there are competing interest groups, one might say, or competing thoughts even among advocates themselves, as to what that remaking just should look like. And so I do think at the end, when it comes down to it, these leaders, as we currently see them, they did not feel enough of the pressure from just enough of the city's electorate to really get this done on the 2024 edition of the ballot. But in the years ahead, I think that those who have advanced advocacy for more fair representation in the city, we've got some homework to do so as to really present this not just to the city council, but to the public. So that we can all land on one page as to just what is needed here. Good ideas, but really difficult to implement. And yet, I'm hoping and I'm hopeful that we are on our way somehow. One thing's for sure, we're in a very interesting moment for it, and the LA County Board expansion, I think, is a fascinating possibility. But it's funny because, as you mentioned, more city council members, specifically Elizabeth, almost the first thing that came to mind for me was more parking nightmares at LA City Hall. Where do you even get started there? Traffic in Los Angeles is another serious issue, and so that might be one more reason why maybe we slightly dodged a bullet this year with potentially more council members in traffic on the streets of Los Angeles.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
Okay, with that said, we've got just one more honorable mention here, and that is for Measure A, which is actually proposing to expand not another city council or county government body, but which is proposing to expand Measure H from almost a decade ago, just as well, I believe, which is money for uh, services for unhoused residents across the county. And so I do think an honorable mention here is merited because, as we have said in this discussion previously, a lot of folks out there are enraged about the lack of progress on housing for our most vulnerable residents out here. And so Measure A at least purports to be an opportunity to keep these funds going for the services which folks need in that respect. Can you say some more for us here?
yeah, so Measure H 2017, that's when it was passed, and it was seen as a big deal for services funding. to give people services. And I think as with a lot of other things, um, and I know there's a lot of skepticism around how the funding gets used. But at the same time, as with other things, including like Prop 36, with how much is actually invested in a certain type of service. Sometimes, so I'm like going all over the place, but like it's kind of like it felt like a big deal when Measure H passed and there was more funding for services
It
because
did
a
feel
lot
like
of
a big deal.
yeah, it was like it was needed, right?
Sales tax, to be sure, which was a
It was a
sales tax.
sales tax, right? It felt like it was needed because everywhere you look or everywhere you turn, somebody's saying, I'm not getting any services. There's no services, you know, for the most part, right? You hear about one or two people, and then like most of the people you talk to who need services, who are unhoused, they're like, no one's coming to give me anything of any real like, you know, consequence or anything. Like it's not going to change my life. There's nothing, you know. The things I need, they're just not enough of, right? So the Measure H provided hundreds of millions of dollars more within the LA County through a quarter cent sales tax. And so this latest thing um, would replace it with a half cent sales tax. And it's not just going to be services, it's going to be also paying for housing, affordable housing. Um, and so like it's upped, but then there's also more that's um the money would be going towards like more types of things. So it's called Measure A and it doesn't have a sunset like Measure H does. Measure H sunsets in 2027. So in about 3 years. It's like a 10-year thing. And then so this one is doesn't like it says like it doesn't end until people decide it ends, right? Um yeah. I think they all say that with the ones that most of the one that don't have sunsets say that, and then people just assume like it's never gonna end. So I think that's kind of like right now, like kind of the iffy part of this, because are people in the mood for another tax that will make things slightly more expensive or a lot more expensive when things are at it's already expensive? And like I guess one thing to note is that groceries don't have that sales tax, right? So then like prepared food, maybe. Yes, it does. So so like it's a sales tax, right? So it functions like a sales tax. So but like I guess because I'm thinking about groceries and how expensive it is, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
but
as
it's
it should be.
it's not necessarily going to affect that. Okay. But it's just people don't want to spend more money on most things, right? So like it's a hard time, I think, possibly for this measure to be around for something that like at least in my reporting, you know, like it's kind of a thing that like there's just not that much services available. So like one of the examples I'm kind of hearing from people who are just kind of like, you know, we don't always trust where this money goes and how it's used and like you know, like they're also like, what can you do about it? Like, you know, like the people I'm talking to, like, you know, provide services, right? So they're not like happy about how the money's being spent. They're watching how like sometimes it's kind of like, oh wow, you know, like this doesn't seem right. There's some political motivation behind how this money is spent. And then, you know, okay, so some others will argue, no, that's not happening. So whatever the case is, there's like some kind of distrust around like how the money already that's being put out is spent, right? But then like people who are providing services are also like, but this is like just got, you know, it's needed, right? So it's kind of like a tough one sometimes for yeah. So yeah, this is the measure. And just to be kind of like you know, according to like the thing, it's supposed to raise like $1.1 billion annually. They have like things built in for oversight. There's this new commission that was set up kind of regionally called La Casa. And the people who are like proponents of this measure say it's like a lot like the Metro Board, which like has elected officials who also sit on these boards. So they kind of have a bit more political, like kind of the things they say they do have a little bit more weight. And so it's less of, like the LA Homelessness Services Authority aren't elected officials on there. So like they're kind of like appointed by elected officials, but like they kind of get pulled in different directions by the different people that they represent. Um, and so like they tend to not have that much power, right? But then like the buck stops with the folks that would be sitting on La Casa. And so it's kind of like those people are going to be together in one room and they're going to be like the Metro board, you know, kind of like that. It's kind of like that concept. So like this La Casa is supposed to like kind of plan regionally like affordable housing um, projects and stuff like that. So like that's also like kind of how the proponents talk about it. And so like yeah. And of course, there's the usual kind of like, groups that are for and against it. People like Howard Jarvis is against it. Um, yeah.
No way.
And like the person that often represents it is like is a um opinions writer for the last newspaper that I worked for, LA Daily
I
News.
see. I see. Shout out LA Daily News, which really does come in handy when it comes to this coverage. I've said before, and I'll say again that the LA needs more and not less media. So shout out to coverage of these races, coverage of these elections, and a real discussion about just how to apportion these funds, which our communities and which our cities generate as a whole in the fifth largest economy in the world in the state of California, which has over 100,000 people without housing and far more who are housing insecure and housing unstable on any given night, and which has so for at least the last decade. Um, to be clear, just as well, Elizabeth, when you reference La Casa, are you noting that this is a commission that would be enabled by something like the passage of Measure A, or is it that this body already exists?
It already exists. So like it's kind of like, hey, it exists. So like if you're worried about the spending of the money, like, there's this planning body, they just sent over like a plan for use of like Measure HLA. No, Measure ULA and other things, right? Not HLA. HLA is a transportation one, just to be clear. But ULA is the funding for the so-called mansion tax for housing, right? So like that was like there's a whole plan that like some of that funding, what it should be done with it. And so like, it kind of it's there as a kind of like a body that plans regionally how
Mhm.
these monies are spent. And it has like elected officials on it. So these are the people that, where the box is supposed to stop with. So
So that makes for even more show notes. Let's link to La Casa. Let's try to get some voters to read more about these bodies established for accounting when it comes to the spending of so many dollars, of so many sales tax revenues, and so on. I think that we have definitely highlighted for folks a number of the different possibilities when it comes to the ballot this November. And as we noted at the outset, because there's so much, we could only cover a certain portion of it, but I am very much satisfied with how we've really given space and time and voice to just what is going on here for our communities and for our city, for our county, and even the state at that. I definitely want to pick up where we are leaving off before too long. That is, as we look into further measures, Elizabeth. And then I also want to invite folks out to a vote by mail party that I'm putting together along with Quién es tu vecindario, or Who is Your Neighborhood, the 501(c)(3) organization that I oversee. Because if voting is like a huge homework assignment, then I think we should take it on together and do so in conversation and authentic dialogue at that. This is very much an example of it. This is very much in honor of it. And so yeah, truly, I have to thank you for taking the time to put it together with me for Los Cuentos de Los Angeles and the state of Cali. I mean, who are we kidding here? This is for everybody.
thanks for doing all that. Like I really appreciate it. Like I think I often crave, like want more people to talk to and to like do homework, this homework student with, like you said. So yeah, it'd be really, I would look forward. So I appreciate you like taking that initiative of like doing that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. But then does that mean that I can count on you to make it out to our vote by mail party, which is
Dude,
on September?
I love going to things. Yes, of course. I mean, what day is it on?
That'll
Like
be a Tuesday.
most of my
Tuesday.
nights are pretty much like I don't do anything. So, so
And yeah,
yeah.
bring the whole family. It's gonna be all ages. It's gonna be friendly for all ages by all means. And yeah, voters need to check in with their reporters like this. So that's what we are putting together. And I thank you for your coverage. I really do respect the work that you put together and the discussions that you try your best to pass along to our communities. So honestly, yeah, I'm glad we put this together.
Thank you.